Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're opening a file that honestly I really didn't see coming.
Oh, it's a surprising one for sure.
Yeah. You know how we usually talk about the absolute titans of the genre? We look at the people whose names are printed in giant gold foil on the front of the paperback.
Right. The household names.
Stephen King's, the Asimovs, the Lovecrafts, the folks everyone knows.
Naturally. Because that is where the spotlight usually shines, right? We are all so drawn to the great man or great woman theory of history.
Oh, definitely.
Where we just assume these singular geniuses appear out of the ether, fully formed, and change the world.
Exactly. We see the mountain peaks, but we completely ignore the tectonic plates that actually push them up there in the first place.
That's a great analogy.
But today, we are looking at the guy who built the bridge those titans walked across. We're looking at the geology, so to speak.
It really is a fascinating case study in what I like to call literary connective tissue.
Connective tissue, yeah.
We are looking at the life and the long career of Robert A.W. Lowndes.
Who is often just known to his friends and colleagues as Doc. Doc Lowndes.
Yes. And when you say connective tissue, you really aren't kidding. I was looking through the source material we pulled for this, and the timeline here is just
staggering.
Staggering. That's the word. We are talking about a single human being who connects the pulp era of the 1930s directly to the modern era of horror superstars.
He spans the entire gap.
He does, and it is a wide gap.
Huge.
If you think about the style of writing in 1935 versus, say, 1975, they are almost different languages.
Yeah, completely different pacing, different tropes.
But Lowndes was fluent in both. On one end of his career, he is a young fan corresponding directly with H.P. Lovecraft.
Which is mind-blowing on its own. We're going to get into the details of those letters shortly because that alone is a story.
Right. And then on the other end, decades later, he is the editor who pulls a manuscript out of the flesh pile and publishes the very first professional stories of Stephen King.
Okay, let's just pause and unpack that for a second. The exact same guy who got letters from Lovecraft gave Stephen King his first break.
The very same guy.
That is wild.
It is. And that is why this deep dive is so important for anyone who cares about genre history. Our mission today is to really explore the life of a man who wore literally every hat in the industry.
Every single hat.
He wasn't just an observer sitting on the sidelines. He was a fan, a poet, a novelist, a historian, and perhaps most importantly, an incredibly influential editor.
It really makes you wonder how many other Doc Lowndes figures are out there quietly shaping the culture we consume, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, we all know the stars, but who are the architects?
That is the question. And usually the architects are completely invisible. They operate behind the scenes. But Lowndes left a paper trail.
A massive paper trail.
Yeah.
So let's rewind the tape. Let's go back to the very beginning. Who was Robert Lowndes before he became Doc? What was the world that created him?
Well, he was born in 1916 and he passed away in 1998.
A full 20th century life.
Exactly. But to truly understand him, we really have to look at the company he kept in those early days. The source material highlights his role as a principal member of a group called the Futurians.
The Futurians. That sounds like, I don't know, secret society from a comic book? Or maybe a synth pop band from the 80s?
In the world of science fiction history, they essentially were a secret society. Just much louder.
Louder.
Very loud. They were based in New York City. And you have to understand the context of fandom in that specific era. This is the late 30s and early 40s.
Right.
There wasn't a clear, rigid line between being a fan and being a pro like there is today.
Right. Today, if I read a book, I'm a fan. If I write a book and sell it, I'm a pro. And there is a giant wall of agents and publishers standing between those two states.
Exactly. Back then, it was a much more fluid ecosystem. It was a permeable membrane.
How so?
You usually started out as a fan, writing letters to the magazines. They literally called them letter acts.
Letter hacks. I love that.
Then you would join clubs, like the Futurians. You published fanzines on clunky mimeograph machines in someone's basement. And the next thing you know, the editor of a professional magazine realizes he needs a story to fill 5 blank pages before going to print.
He eats filler.
Right. So he asks you if you have anything lying around. You hand over a draft, and suddenly, boom, you're a professional writer.
Sounds incredibly organic.
It was very organic, and the Futurians were essentially the radical wing of this whole process.
Radical in what way?
Well, they included people who would go on to be massive figures. Isaac Asimov, Frederick Pohl, Donald Wollheim.
Heavy hitters.
The heaviest. These were young, incredibly smart, incredibly opinionated people who truly believed science fiction was the most important thing in the world. They argued about it constantly.
And Lowndes was right in the center of that energy.
A principal member. And that specific environment is crucial for understanding him because it taught him early on that literature is a conversation, not a monologue.
You write, you critique, you argue, you publish.
Exactly. It's a dialogue.
The source mentions his relationship with Donald A. Wollheim specifically. They were fellow Futurians, right?
Yes, and Donald Wollheim is another absolute titan. He eventually founded Double Books.
Go, the yellow spine paperback.
The very ones. Everyone who reads sci-fi or fantasy knows those yellow spines.
Yeah.
But back then, he and Lowndes were just a couple of aspiring writers trying to break into the magazines. And that relationship led directly to Lowndes' very first fiction credit.
Or, well, uncredited credit, if we want to be technical about it.
Exactly. I love these little details in the source material because they show the unvarnished reality of the business back then.
What actually happened with that story?
So his first story was called The Outpost at Altark.
The Outpost at Altark. Great pulp title.
Classic. It was published in Super Science in 1940. Now, officially, or at least in terms of how the actual physical work was done, it was a collaboration between Lowndes and Donald Wollheim.
They wrote it together.
Yeah.
But his name wasn't on it.
Uncredited. It was likely published under a house name or perhaps as Wollheim's name. And that speaks volumes about how these guys operated in the trenches.
They were just churning out content.
Churning it out, helping each other, ghostwriting, collaborating, polishing each other's drafts. It was a creative factory.
It really wasn't about ego at that point, was it? It was about survival, getting into print.
It was strictly about getting the words on the page and getting the check in the mail to pay rent. But even if his name wasn't on the cover, that story, The Outpost at Altark, marks a huge transition for him.
The moment he crosses the threshold.
Exactly. From enthusiast to creator.
And somewhere in there, amidst all the scraping for bylines and the intense club meetings, he picks up the nickname Doc.
Doc Lowndes, yes. It became his permanent moniker for the rest of his life.
Does the source say where it came from?
It doesn't specify the exact origin story, unfortunately. Like, we don't know if he performed first aid at a raucous sci-fi convention or something like that, but whatever the reason, it stuck.
It really fits the vibe, though. Calling someone Doc implies a certain level of authority. Respect.
It does. It suggests a sort of fix-it capability. In the fast-paced pulp world, you really needed a doc.
You needed a surgeon for your story.
Precisely. You needed someone who could look at a broken, messy narrative and instantly diagnose the problem. They could say, the pacing is completely anemic right here, or the dialogue is completely fractured in this scene.
And Lowndes became that person.
He became that person for the entire industry.
It definitely fits the image of a guy who knows where all the bodies are buried, literally speaking.
Mm.
But let's go back a little bit further in the timeline, because before he was publishing uncredited stories with Wollheim, he was doing something else. He was communicating directly with the master himself, H.P. Lovecraft.
This is one of the most significant touchstones in his entire life. We really have to remember the timeline here to grasp the impact. Lovecraft died in March of 1937.
Okay, I want everyone to keep that exact date in mind.
Yeah.
March 1937.
Right. And Lowndes received 2 letters of encouragement from H.P. Lovecraft in 1937.
Wow. So right at the absolute finish line of Lovecraft's life.
Literally weeks before the end. Imagine the immense emotional weight of that. You are a young writer, barely out of your teens, full of ambition. You reach out to your absolute idol, the man who practically invented the specific type of horror you love.
And he actually writes back.
He writes back. And not just a brief, "Thanks for writing, kid, keep it up."
No.
No, these were letters of deep encouragement, real validation from the master. And then, mere weeks or a couple of months later, that idol passes away.
That has to fundamentally change a person. It creates a profound sense of obligation, doesn't it? Like he's thinking, he passed the torch to me, now I have to carry it.
It completely validates their path in a profound way. And we know this happened, and we know exactly how much it mattered because those letters were meticulously preserved.
They weren't just tossed in a drawer.
Not at all. They were eventually reprinted much later in Crypt of Cthulhu, which is a major journal dedicated entirely to Lovecraft scholarship.
And Lowndes didn't just frame the letters and walk away. He really leaned into that influence, didn't he? He took up the mantle.
He became a true disciple, in a way. He transitioned that inspiration directly into his own dark fantasy writing. The source details a few key works that clearly show this lineage.
There were some of the key ones.
First off, there was a story called The Abyss in 1941.
The Abyss. Good, solid, ominous title. You know what you're getting with that.
A classic weird tale title. And then there was The Leapers in 1942. Now, The Leapers is super interesting because it shows us the complicated game these writers played with pseudonyms.
Oh, the pseudonym game. I swear, I feel like every single writer from this era had at least 5 different names they published under. Why did they do that so often?
Well, there are multiple reasons. Sometimes an editor simply wouldn't want the exact same name on the table of contents twice in one issue. So if you were prolific and sold 2 stories to the same magazine that month, one of them had to be under a fake name.
Makes sense. It makes the magazine look like it has a bigger stable of writers.
Exactly. Other times they wanted to sound more exotic or distinguished, or sometimes they just really wanted to separate their dark horror work from their lighter sci-fi work. Brand management, essentially.
So what happened with the Leapers? Which name did he use?
The Leapers first appeared in future fantasy and science fiction in December 1942, but it wasn't attributed to Robert Lowndes. It was credited to Carol Gray.
Carol Gray. That is a bit of a departure from Doc Lowndes.
Isn't it? It creates this fascinating bibliographic puzzle for historians later on. They look at the table of contents and think, who is this Carol Gray person?
When it's just Bob.
Exactly, it's just Bob. But the story of the Leapers didn't even stop there. Lowndes kept coming back to it over the years.
Was he not happy with it?
Or he just felt he could do it better. He revised the Leapers years later for the Magazine of Horror, and then much, much later, there was a third distinct version created specifically for that Crypt of Cthulhu tribute issue.
So he was tinkering with this one single story for decades.
He was constantly refining it. The final version even featured a new introduction written by him, where he meticulously explained the entire publication history.
That shows a lot of care.
It really shows a writer who cares deeply about the actual work, not just the quick paycheck. He was refining his personal contribution to the Lovecraftian tradition. He wanted to get it absolutely right.
And there was another one mentioned in the notes, right? Settler's Wall?
Yes. Or, as it was known when he originally wrote it under yet another pseudonym, Wilfred Owen Morley. The story was called The Long Wall.
Wilfred Owen Morley. That sounds very distinguished, like a British poet who tragically died in World War I.
It really does sound like that, doesn't it? Very stately, very serious. That one ran in Stirring Science Stories in March 1942, and again, he revised it twice over his career.
Seems like Lowndes was rarely satisfied with the first draft. Or perhaps he just constantly saw new opportunities to improve the stories as the market and his own skills evolved.
That's spot on. Usually with pulp writers, the stereotype is write it fast, sell it instantly, forget about it completely, and move on to the next one.
Right, the penny a word grind.
Exactly. But Lowndes treated these specific stories, especially the Lovecraftian ones, with a real level of reverence. They weren't just commercial product for him. They were art.
Speaking of art, he didn't just write short stories. The source material mentions he wrote poetry too, which feels a bit rare for the pulps.
This is where the absolute depth of his fandom really shines through. He wrote a series of poems called The Annals of Archaea.
The Annals of Archaea sounds very mythic.
And these weren't just random standalone poems. They were explicitly directly inspired by Lovecraft's fungi from Yuggoth's sonnet cycle.
Okay, that is a seriously deep cut. For listeners who might not be deep into Lovecraft lore, what exactly is fungi from Yuggoth?
It is this legendary sequence of sonnets written by Lovecraft. It essentially tells a very vague, nightmarish cosmic story entirely through verse.
Which sounds incredibly difficult.
It's incredibly difficult to pull off well because you are combining the very strict structural rules of a traditional sonnet, the precise rhythm, the strict rhyme scheme, the meter,
Right.
with the chaotic, sanity-shattering cosmic horror of the Cthulhu mythos.
So you basically have to make unspeakable nightmares rhyme.
Basically, yes. And for Lowndes to sit down and write a full 12-sonnet sequence as a tribute to that, that takes intense dedication.
Just writing one good sonnet is hard enough.
Writing 12 of them all thematically linked to a specific fictional mythos. That is a true labor of love.
Did anyone actually read them at the time? Or was this just something he did for his own personal amusement?
Oh, they were published. Donald Wollheim, remember him from the Futurians?
Yeah, the Dido Books guy.
He issued them as a standalone booklet through his own imprint, the Fantagraph Press.
Wollheim again. Those Futurian guys really looked out for each other, didn't they?
They absolutely did. And later on, those sonnets were reprinted in Crypt of Cthulhu. It shows that his peers, the people deep in the genre, truly recognized the literary quality of his tribute.
It wasn't just amateur fan fiction.
Not at all. It was considered a respectful, worthy addition to the broader canon.
Okay, so we have established that he was a super fan, a dedicated poet, and a very talented writer in the Lovecraft vein. But that is not really what put his name in the history books, is it? It was the editing. That's where he leaves his biggest footprint.
Correct. The editor's desk is where Doc Lowndes truly left his massive mark on the industry. Specifically, we need to dive into the Columbia Publications era.
Columbia Publications. This is where he really starts running the show. What was the publishing landscape like at that point?
So we are moving into the late 40s and the 1950s. We're shifting away from the large format, ragged-edged pulp magazines to the smaller digest magazines.
Digest format. Think Reader's Digest size.
Exactly that size. Smaller, thicker, easier to carry. Lowndes was helming some absolute heavy hitters for Columbia. Future Science Fiction, and Science Fiction Quarterly.
Science Fiction Quarterly. I really love how completely literal the titles were back then. No ambiguity whatsoever. You get what it says on the tin.
Exactly. You knew exactly what you were paying your 15 cents for. But dealing with a whole slate of digest magazines, that is a tremendous grind.
Why is it such a grind compared to the older pulps?
Because you have incredibly strict deadlines, razor-thin budgets, and an insatiable nonstop need for content. You have to fill all those pages every single month or every single quarter without fail.
The presses don't stop.
They don't. If a promised story falls through at the last minute, you have to write one yourself under a fake name or find a usable one literally overnight.
And he wasn't just sitting there reading robot stories and rocket ship adventures all day, was he?
No, and this is what impresses me most about that classic pulp work ethic. The source specifically points out his genre versatility. He wasn't just editing sci-fi titles.
What else was he doing?
He was editing crime fiction magazines. He was editing westerns. He was editing sports fiction.
Sports fiction.
Sports fiction, yeah.
That feels like a whole different universe from Cryptic Cthulhu. I mean, going from the Ancient Ones are awakening from their cosmic slumber to bottom of the ninth, bases loaded.
It is completely different, but that is the exact mark of a true professional pulp editor. You had to implicitly understand core story structure, narrative pacing, and audience expectations, regardless of the genre dressing.
Mechanics of the story.
Exactly. Whether it is a cowboy facing a deadly shootout at high noon or a starship captain facing a supernova, the underlying editorial skills are completely transferable.
It's all just tension and resolution at the end of the day.
Precisely. And Lowndes mastered them all. He could look at a Western draft and say, this dialogue feels way too modern for 1880, and then immediately look at a murder mystery and say, the clues aren't laid out fairly for the reader here.
And doing all of that simultaneously across multiple titles, that is an insane juggling act.
It required an immense, almost superhuman work ethic, but it also gave him a highly unique vantage point in the industry. He saw raw talent across the entire board. He wasn't siloed into just one genre, which brings us perfectly to his role as a talent scout.
Right, the source brings up a name here, Edward D. Hoche.
Edward D. Hoche is an absolute legend in the mystery field. He is often referred to as the king of the short story.
Why is that?
Because he wrote something staggering, like 900 short stories over his career, and it was Doc Lowndes who discovered him and gave him his start.
That is a pretty big feather in the cap right there, finding a guy who writes 900 stories.
But what's even more telling about Lowndes as a person is the loyalty. The source explicitly states that Hoche continued to contribute his stories to Lowndes' fiction magazines for as long as Lowndes was editing them.
Wow, that is actually really rare, isn't it? Usually a writer gets a big break, builds a name, and then moves on to the highest bidder. Like, thanks for the start, Doc, but Playboy or Esquire pays 10 times as much now.
Exactly. That is the normal trajectory. For a superstar like Hoche to stick with Lowndes for years suggests that Lowndes was a genuine pleasure to work with.
He must have been an incredible editor.
Someone who respected the writers, gave constructive feedback, didn't butcher their prose, or just ran a ship that writers actively wanted to be a part of. That kind of long-term professional loyalty does not happen by accident in publishing.
No, it definitely doesn't. So he's grinding away at Columbia Publications, doing everything from cowboys to aliens. But then we hit the 1960s in the timeline. And this, to me, is the most exciting part of his entire career.
The 1960s revival? Yes. This is the Health Knowledge, Inc. era.
Health Knowledge, Inc. Honestly, it sounds like they should be selling mail-order vitamins or medical encyclopedias, not horror stories.
It really does sound very clinical and sterile. But in 1963, under that bizarre corporate umbrella, Lowndes initiates the Magazine of Horror.
1963. So you're officially moving out of the golden age of pulp and into something entirely new. The whole counterculture is just starting to bubble up in America.
And Lowndes had a very specific, very clever editorial strategy for this new magazine. He didn't just want to publish purely new stuff. He intentionally mixed reprints of classic stories with brand new material.
Why do that, though? Why not just feature all new cutting-edge stuff? Was it just a cheap way to save money on author payments?
Well, there were two reasons. First, yes, economics played a part. Reprints are generally much cheaper or even completely free if the original author's copyright lapsed and it fell into the public domain. That obviously helps stretch a tight magazine budget.
Sure, practical business.
But second, and far more importantly for the health of the genre itself, it was deeply educational.
Educational, how do you mean?
Think about the demographics. In 1963, you had a whole new generation of eager readers coming of age. Kids born during or just after the Second World War who completely missed the golden era of the pulps in the 30s and 40s.
Right, they never saw those original fragile issues of Weird Tales on the newsstands.
Exactly. By carefully selecting and reprinting the absolute classics, Lowndes was actively teaching this new audience. He was saying, here is where we came from, here is the foundation.
He was essentially building and curating a canon for them.
Exactly. He's building a syllabus. And then, right next to those legendary classics, he deliberately places a brand new story by a young, unknown writer.
Oh, I see. That's powerful.
He was contextualizing the new voices within the long history of the field. He was subtly telling the reader, this new kid, he belongs on the exact same shelf as Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft. Take him seriously.
That is brilliant editorial sequencing. It's like a perfectly curated playlist. If you like that classic track from the 30s, check out this brand new artist we found.
Precisely, and the formula absolutely worked. The magazine of horror was popular enough and profitable enough to spawn a whole family of companion magazines under Health Knowledge.
He built a franchise.
He really did. Startling mystery stories in 1966. Famous science fiction, also in 1966. Weird terror tales in 1969. Bizarre fantasy fiction in 1970.
He was building an absolute empire.
A very successful mini-empire, certainly. And on top of all that fiction, he even edited the non-fantastic titles for the parent company, like Thrilling Western Magazine and Worldwide Adventure.
The man simply did not stop editing. He was a machine.
A dedicated machine.
Okay, but we absolutely have to talk about startling mystery stories, because buried in that stack of obscure digest magazines is a bomb. A good bomb, but a massive historical bomb.
A true literary nuclear weapon, yes.
Startling mystery stories. Who did he publish that makes this so important?
That magazine is highly notable for carrying the very first professional stories of Stephen King.
The Stephen King. The Shining, It, The Stand, Salem's Lot, Stephen King.
The very same, the undisputed master of modern horror. The story was called The Glass Floor.
Wow. Just think about that. So long before Carrie, long before he was a household name with movies and miniseries, Stephen King was just another guy desperately trying to get a short story published somewhere.
Just a young, struggling man up in Maine, typing away on a heavy typewriter, collecting a massive spike full of rejection slips. And Robert Doc Lowndes was the editor sitting at a desk in New York who pulled that brown envelope out of the slush pile, read it, and said, yes, I will buy this one.
That is just, I mean, imagine the alternate reality where Lowndes is having a bad day and just stamps no on that envelope.
It is a genuinely chilling thought for any horror fan, isn't it? Rejection is incredibly discouraging for a young writer. If King hadn't found that early platform and that crucial validation in startling mystery stories, does he keep going with the same fire?
Does he pivot to something else? Does he find another outlet?
Probably. Raw talent like that usually breaks through eventually, but Lowndes provided that vital, crucial first step. He swung the door open.
It totally validates Lowndes' incredible eye for talent, doesn't it? It proves it wasn't just a fluke with Edward Hutch back in the day. He spotted Stephen King when King was an absolute nobody.
And it wasn't just King either.
There's more.
Oh, yes. The source notes that he also published the first professional stories of F. Paul Wilson.
Another huge name in the genre.
Exactly. F. Paul Wilson, famous for the massive Repairman Jack series and the classic novel The Keep.
Wow.
So in this one specific magazine run, under this weird health knowledge banner, Doc Lowndes discovers and launches two of the foundational masters of modern horror and thriller fiction.
That cements his legacy forever. Right there. You could delete the entire rest of his career, delete the Lovecraft letters, delete the poetry, delete all the westerns and sports stories, and he is still historically essential as the guy who found Stephen King and F. Paul Wilson.
Arguably, yes. That alone earns him a chapter in the history books. He is the ultimate bridge. He literally took the torch from Lovecraft's generation and physically handed it to King's generation.
It's a simplified view of his life, but it's really not inaccurate.
It's the most impactful way to frame his contribution.
But unfortunately, the platform itself, those magazines, they weren't as durable as the legendary writers they launched.
No, sadly they weren't. The final collapse of Health Knowledge, Inc. in 1971 abruptly ended the run of all these digest magazines.
Ouch. What actually happened? Why did they fold if they had such great talent?
The entire market shifted beneath their feet. It was a mix of brutal distribution issues and rapidly changing consumer tastes.
People weren't buying magazines anymore.
The classic digest magazine format was dying out, being rapidly replaced by paperback original anthologies and full-length novels. People wanted to buy a paperback book, not a flimsy digest. It really marked the definitive end of an era. Magazine of horror, startling mystery stories, all of them, just gone.
But Lowndes didn't just pack up his desk and retire, did he? He seems like the kind of guy who would just dust himself off and find another desk somewhere else.
Oh no, Lowndes was the ultimate survivor. After the fiction magazines all folded, he went right back to work. He got a job with Gernsback Publications, but crucially, not working on science fiction.
No, what was he doing?
He was hired to work on their nonfiction magazine, Sexology.
Sexology. Did I hear that right?
Sexology. You heard that correctly.
Talk about a massive career pivot, going from editing Lovecraftian cosmic horror and Stephen King thrillers to editing Sexology.
It really is quite a leap. But it speaks heavily to his core professionalism as a working editor. To him, words are words, deadlines are deadlines, page layouts are page layouts.
They needed to play the bills.
He needed to work, and he possessed the highly technical skills to manage a publication from start to finish, completely regardless of what the actual subject matter was.
I guess if you can successfully edit a convoluted story about a tentacled monster from a non-Euclidean dimension, you can figure out how to edit, well, pretty much anything.
You really have to respect the hustle. He was a dedicated, working, blue-collar writer and editor right up until the end.
Now, we have talked extensively about his short stories and his massive editorial runs, but the source material also lists several novels. He wasn't strictly a short-form guy his whole life.
No, he produced several longer works as well, and they are quite varied in tone and audience. For example, there was Mystery of the Third Mine, which was a juvenile fiction novel published back in 1953.
Juvenile fiction, so basically what we would call YA or young adult fiction today.
Essentially, yes, sci-fi adventure stories aimed specifically at younger readers. It was a very big, lucrative market in the 50s.
Right, getting kids into sci-fi early.
Think of the famous Winston science fiction set, that kind of gateway literature.
Then there was a book called The Duplicated Man.
Oh, that's a notable one.
It sounds kind of trippy. What's the story behind it?
Well, it was a major collaboration with James Blish. It was officially published as a book in 1959, but the text had actually appeared in magazine form a few years earlier.
James Blish is another really heavy hitter in classic sci-fi, right?
Very heavy. He wrote the famous Cities in Flight series, and he is very well known for writing the original Star Trek novelizations.
So seeing Doc Lowndes team up with him is significant.
It is. It firmly puts Lowndes in the higher intellectual circle of the genre at that time. Blish was known for being a very rigorous, very critical, very smart guy.
He wouldn't suffer fools.
Exactly. He wouldn't collaborate with just any hack off the street. He clearly respected Lowndes' chops.
And what about Believer's World? That's another novel mentioned in our notes.
That one has a very interesting history. It was published as a standalone novel by Avalon Books in 1961, but it was actually expanded from an older serialized story called A Matter of Faith that first appeared back in 1952.
Oh, rewriting old material again.
And get this, when he originally published the serialized version, he wrote it under the pseudonym Michael Sherman.
Michael Sherman. Yet another name to add to the massive list. Carol Gray, Wilfred Owen Morley, Michael Sherman.
He really collected them over the years. He also published The Puzzle Planet in 1961. So think about the timeline here. While he was exhaustively editing all these various magazines, managing the westerns, the sports pulps, the mystery titles, he was still somehow finding the time and energy to write full-length novels.
The man must have literally never slept.
I genuinely suspect he didn't sleep much. Or more likely, he just drafted very fast.
But we also have to touch on his work as a historian. Because Lowndes wasn't just creating the history of the genre in real time, he was actively documenting it later in life. He seemed to have a deep sense of self-awareness about the historical movement he was a part of.
Right, that transition from creator to chronicler. The source material mentions a specific book called Three Faces of Science Fiction.
Published in 1973.
Yes. And the subtitle of that book is absolutely fascinating. It is SF as Instruction, Propaganda, and Delight.
Instruction, Propaganda, and Delight. That is a pretty sophisticated academic framework to view pulp fiction through.
It really is. It's not just basic fan gushing about cool spaceships. The book collects his various literary columns that he originally wrote for famous science fiction. It shows that he was thinking very critically, very analytically about what the genre actually does to the reader.
Let's break that framework down a bit. Instruction, Propaganda, Delight. What did he mean by that?
Well, Instruction clearly covers the classic Gernsbackian idea that science fiction should actively teach the reader real science.
Like explaining orbital mechanics in the middle of a space battle.
Exactly. Then you have propaganda, which might refer to stories that deliberately push a specific social or political viewpoint.
Like cautionary tales warning us about nuclear war or overpopulation.
Right, the heavy thematic stuff. And finally, delight is simply the pure entertainment value, the core sense of wonder and escapism. Lowndes astutely argued that the best of the genre was always a complex mix of all three of those elements.
That is a really nuanced, modern take for a guy writing in 1973.
It shows how sharp his analytical mind was. And then there is his other major historical work, The Gernsback Days.
Now that sounds like a definitive, weighty history book.
It is a major piece of scholarship, co-authored with the renowned anthologist Mike Ashley. The full title is The Gernsback Days, a study of the evolution of modern science fiction from 1911 to 1936.
1911 to 1936. That is the absolute primordial soup of sci-fi.
Exactly. The era before the Golden Age. And who better to possibly write it? Lowndes literally lived through the tail end of that specific era and personally knew many of the key people involved.
Right. And for listeners who don't know, Hugo Gernsback is basically the father of the modern genre magazine. He launched Amazing Stories.
Yes, the Hugo Awards are named after him. For Lowndes to co-author that definitive history puts him in the highly unique position of being a primary source historian.
It's basically like having a decorated general write the definitive history of the war he actually fought in.
That is a perfect analogy. He had the ground truth. He wasn't just sitting in a dusty university library reading old, crumbling magazines. He vividly remembered buying those exact issues fresh at the corner newsstand.
He lived it.
He remembered arguing passionately with Donald Wollheim about those stories in a cramped New York apartment. He brought personal context to the history.
So if we look back at the big picture, we have covered the eager fan, the dedicated poet, the prolific writer, the tireless editor, the brilliant talent scout, and finally the rigorous historian. It is an awful lot for one single life.
It is an incredible, unmatched resume in the field. And importantly, it was ultimately recognized by his peers while he was still alive. In 1991, he received the first Fandom Hall of Fame award.
Which honestly feels very, very deserved after hearing all this.
Absolutely deserved. First Fandom is a specific organization that specifically honors the people who were there at the very start of the community and worked to keep the flame alive. Linz fits that exact description perfectly.
He was there when the foundational concrete was poured, and he was still there working when the massive skyscraper was fully built.
Beautifully put.
So, as we start to wrap this deep dive up, what does this all mean for us today? We started off the show by calling him the literary bridge.
And I think that title absolutely holds up to scrutiny. Just look at the physical span of time. He starts his journey in the late 1930s, completely saturated in the direct influence of H.P. Lovecraft.
The era of the old weird tale, cosmic horror.
Right. And he takes that specific torch and carries it safely through the massive pulp explosion of the 40s and 50s. He keeps the digest magazines alive through sheer willpower, finding and nurturing new prolific writers like Edward Hawke along the way.
And then, in the 60s and 70s, he successfully hands that same torch off to Stephen King and F. Paul Wilson.
He is the relay runner who ran the longest, hardest leg of the entire race.
Exactly. Without him, without his specific eye for talent and his tireless work ethic, the baton very well might have been dropped.
Or at the very least, it would have been picked up by someone else entirely, and the final destination of the genre might have been drastically different. The tone of modern horror might look nothing like it does today.
It really makes you stop and think about the hidden ecosystem of creativity. As readers, we focus so intensely on the author, with a capital A.
We do. We mythologize them.
We worship Lovecraft, we obsess over King, but we so rarely spend time talking about the editor, the person sitting behind a desk making the calls.
That is the crucial, lingering question here. The vital role of the gatekeeper in art. We so often think of the word gatekeeper as a purely negative term today.
Right, we picture people who snobbishly keep others out.
Yeah.
The person aggressively saying, no, you don't belong here.
Exactly. But Doc Lowndes was a gatekeeper who explicitly existed to open the gate. He actively facilitated the difficult transition from one older generation of masters to the next new generation.
He essentially said, come in, look closely at what we've done before you, and now show us what you can do next.
Without a Doc Lowndes sitting at that desk, does the torch actually get passed?
Maybe. I mean, you said talent finds a way.
It usually does, but it almost certainly might not have burned nearly as brightly, and the direct connective tissue between the generations might have been permanently severed.
We might have had a clean, jarring break between the old pulps and the modern bestsellers, rather than a continuous evolving lineage. And that is a really profound thought worth mulling over. Next time you pick up a thick Stephen King paperback at the bookstore, or even watch a modern horror movie heavily inspired by those tropes, maybe just give a little mental nod to Doc Lowndes,
The invisible architect.
the man who said yes when it mattered the most.
Indeed.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It has been an absolute journey through time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk about him.
See y'all next time. Keep reading and keep looking for the people behind the pages.